This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Ewan McGregor stars as Count Alexander Rostov in A Gentleman in Moscow, the new limited series based on the best-selling novel. Stream it with the Paramount Plus with Showtime plan. Visit ParamountPlus.com to try it free.
Welcome to The After Party, a TSF Network podcast, a mixtape of purposeful, encouraging, and fun content from across all the shows who are part of our podcast network. I'm Heather Cook, Head of Advertising and Partnerships.
And I'm Mandy Hernandez, the Project Manager. Before we start, we have a little favor to ask of you. The After Party, this podcast, has been around for a couple months now, and we are interested to know what you think about it. We want to know what you want to hear more of on the show, what we could do better, and just your overall feedback. So we put together a quick 3-minute survey that you can find in the show notes. Click on the link that says survey and answer some questions. We also want to learn who you are, too, so we would be so grateful if you could take the time to do that for us. Heck, pause this conversation right now and go to fill it out and come back to us. And thank you in advance. Today's episode is from our friends Michael and Melissa in the podcast called Where We Are.
Ooh, yes, this episode is called We Finally Talk About Christian Nationalism. They talk about the meaning and utility of the term and answer listener questions about the topic. It's a very interesting conversation, so let's tune in to learn more.
All right, Melissa, Christian nationalism. I want you to tee up the conversation. You have a lot to say. I have a lot to say, but let's set the stage a bit. What is this conversation about?
It seems like it's about a lot of things, that there are a lot of varying interests at play here as to what it is and how it's defined, how it's funded, how it will be used based on what people are studying and how they're defining it and how it should be, fought against. So there is a lot of competing interests with Christian nationalism, as there has been with ideologies in the past that have been connected to some form of violence or terrorism. So since January 6th of 2021, the conversation around Christian nationalism has increased. Like, I agree with anybody there who says that, but Christian nationalism has been around for quite a long time. And part of the conversations is part of the problems that we have had is that, no, this is not a brand new thing.
Whoa. Let's start with what is Christian nationalism?
Yes, because that is one of the questions that we received a few times from folks. And we thought, because there is no set definition, kind of like there is no set definition of terrorism. So we're constantly dealing with we're just constantly dealing with different definitions. So we wanted to...
I just want to it's so important to set this up properly. So, yes, in the academic sense, quote, there is no set definition like terrorism, but terrorism is a term itself that has been contested both academically and popularly at the popular level for a very, very, very long time.
Yep.
Meanwhile, Christian nationalism at the popular level, you will not find a major mainstream survey on the topic before 2015.
Yep. Which
tells you something. We'll talk more about that. By the way, I was about to
get into it.
I was about to get into it.
Let's.
So that's important to say. But Melissa, what are some of what's a popular definition, or I should say, a academic definition that's been teased out over the last few years?
Yes, so for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to just choose one of the definitions. And this one comes from the book Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, both are sociologists. And Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. Christian nationalism contends that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian from top to bottom in its self-identity, interpretations of its own history, sacred symbols, cherished values, and public policies, and it aims to keep it that way. But the Christian in Christian nationalism is more about identity than religion. It carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. There's a lot there. And there's a lot to discuss. And again, this is just one definition. Michael, do you want to react to that so far?
Yeah, can you reread it and slowly, just so folks can process?
Yes.
Process it.
Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. Christian nationalism contends that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian from top to bottom. That's in its self-identity, interpretations of its own history, sacred symbols, cherished values, and public policies, and it aims to keep it that way. But the Christian in Christian nationalism is more about identity than religion. It carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism.
Okay. So, so this, a few things. This conversation in its current form is inextricable from Donald Trump, the political and sociological and religious fallout of Donald Trump, both at a cultural level, and I think this is really important, at a personal level. Like, this conversation helps to answer questions that people have, not just about what's happening in our politics, but to help people make sense of personal experiences that they've had and their personal processing of what has happened politically. How did Donald Trump get elected? How did white evangelicals come to support a man like Donald Trump, who was on the cover of Playboy and the billionaire and materialist and vulgar, etc., etc., etc. So that would be one thing. The second thing I'd just say is this conversation is emblematic of the increasingly rapid transmission of academic conversations into public discourse. Whereas it used to take decades for academic concepts like this to develop, be refined, and then if they ever got out of academia, take a long time for them to penetrate popular discourse. We now see, and this for many reasons, this is because of the increasingly open nature of social media platforms and news outlets. This is because so much, such a high percentage of the population is college educated. So these conversations that are developed by academics and hammered out by academics make it to the public stage much more quickly than they used to, so that now they basically are parallel tracks. The academic refinement happens in conversation with the public receiving and processing these ideas in a way that is, I think, somewhat novel. And so those would be two sort of context-setting things I would say in relation to that that definition and just to Christian nationalism generally. This is a conversation that in its current sort of referring to the term Christian nationalism is inextricable from Donald Trump. And then number two, it's a academic conversation that has made its way into public life as the academic conversation is developing and as definitions are being developed and tweaked and that kind of thing.
And one of the problems, and I mean, we'll get into this, but one of the problems that stems from this going from an academic to a public conversation is that it's very, and even in the definitions that I just read that come out of Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry's framework from their 2020 book, it says that the Christian and Christian nationalism is more about identity than religion. That's actually really hard to parse out and to constantly keep reminding the general public of that aspect. And yet it is huge to the entire enchilada. I mean, a pivotal aspect of what we're talking about here. Because when it comes to the now decade of discourse, the couple decades of discourse that we've had on terrorism, and then further into what has been known as, Islamic extremism. Part of the problem with that whole area of scholarship was that for the longest time, scholars emphasized that Islamic terrorism or Islamic extremism always came out of the religion was the starting point, and then the ideology came after, when scholars over the last just few years have actually discovered, who would have thought that actually religion is just a tool or a channel through which you actually perpetrate your ideology, that it's not the actual religion itself that's the problem. And like Perry and Whitehead are very careful to also say that this is what we have found so far as well, but to actually keep that as part of what the general public thinks when they hear Christian nationalism, what it's doing, and that, a certain percentage of Christians in this nation are, it's getting higher and people actually identify with this, and oh no, that this jump from the actual ideology, but beyond like the whole religion aspect of it, and how much does it actually influence, and how much of it a tool or a driver of it is hugely important. Is that jumping from the ideology to actual violence or actual action? There is a spectrum, again, that Whitehead, Perry, and then Perry and Gorski do in their book from this past year, are very clear that there's a spectrum, but to actually communicate that there's a spectrum, that if someone were to say, yes, I assent to the few things of the success of the United States is part of God's plan and the federal government should, advocate Christian values. Yes, I agree with that. To jump from you're a Christian nationalist to you're an actual violent extremist, there is a chasm there, and yet people are easily walking across that bridge. Yeah. And conflating the two. So there's that comes out of there. And I have one other thing to say, but Michael, you.
Yeah, no. So I just want to again sort of step back and just Melissa, how would you? Well, I'll sort of state my opinion and sort of ask you to react, which is. How does what is the traction here? Mm-hmm. What is the good faith concern about Christian nationalism? And I think it springs from January 6th. Mm-hmm. I think Charlottesville. Mm-hmm. This rise of
actual instances of violence.
This rise of violence and right-wing vitriol, and it is politically, it is coded in a partisan.
Yes.
The concern is directly related to something that relates to the partisan spectrum.
Yes.
I think that is where the heart of the concern comes from when people talk about why we need to care about Christian nationalism. That is what they refer to first. That is sort of the tip of the spear. Now, I think if you talk to some of the groups that are advocating using Christian nationalism, advocating against Christian nationalism, then you get a more diffuse range of concerns that are often selectively conflated, selectively sort of included in why Christian nationalism is bad in some cases, and then left off when it's sort of politically convenient. So you have a lot of folks who would say Christian nationalism is bad because of its policy impacts on abortion, on LGBT rights, on immigration, on so there's this sort of policy approach on social issues in particular. You have people who would say, well, Christian nationalism is, we need to be concerned about Christian nationalism because it drives xenophobic views. It drives sort of antisocial behavior. So that's another bucket.
Yep.
You have people who would say Christian nationalism is bad because faith and religion has no place in politics and no place in civic life. So to put Christianity and the nation together is inherently a negative thing. There are other sort of reasons. So I have some points related to that, but am I missing anything there? Why do you think? Is there any other reason why this conversation has become salient? Now, I mentioned the antisocial stuff. Again, I also think that a lot of this is personal. I think a lot of this is people trying to come to terms with their uncle being sort of consumed with politics and saying going to a weird church and trying to make sense of all that. But yeah, what would you say?
A couple points here. So just to that very last point there, you're saying it's not just personal on that level, on the sort of popular public level, it's also personal on the scholarship level, which is also one of the troubling things for me. Because I've been in the violent extremism space for a very long time now, and I've read a lot of literature, folks. I've read stuff on drug warfare, gang warfare, violent extremism from all kinds of ideologies, from various contexts that are very localized throughout the world. And specifically in Christian nationalism, especially more modern writings on Christian nationalism, I look at the background of a lot of the scholars, and I'm not going to pinpoint any scholar right now because I'm just saying this broadly, that I think too many are coming from backgrounds in which they're carrying too much emotional baggage into their scholarship. And I think that we need more scholars on this if we do agree that this is something we need to be looking into. And I would agree it is, because we know that Christian nationalism is a real thing because it's been around for a while. It's been called a few different things. Like the Ku Klux Klan is a white...
No, I want to stop you.
Yeah.
I want to stop you there because the conversation, and I think this is really important, there are threads of this that are not new.
Yes.
And there are aspects of the conversation that are really reminiscent of previous debates. But I do want to because the definitions are so unsettled in my view, and because I think it's really hard to draw a single line between what you might refer to now looking back as Christian nationalism in one context to what people are talking about now. I just want to state my discomfort with the idea of saying like this is not new. It's like, yeah, it's not new in some ways. It is new in some ways.
But the way that it's being talked about now and framed is new. But like I was just about to mention, the Ku Klux Klan historically has been called white Christian nationalists. It's also been called, just plain white supremacists. It's been called Christo-fascists. Like it's been called, but it has been called white Christian nationalists. So like it has existed in the past, like exactly what you're saying. But and that's why I say with like the scholarship in particular, I want it to improve. There are way too many scholars who have discovered, again, like I said, in the past few years, they've looked at the pitfalls of what defining Islamic extremism as, and how they defined how people would sort of be radicalized or de-radicalized. They have seen the pitfalls of all that scholarship and the damage that it has done to Muslim communities around the world. And a lot are sort of backtracking, going back and relooking at like and having to contextualize very, very specifically to the nuances of various communities to say, okay, exactly what do we mean by this? How does this actually happen? And have discovered that most of the time it's not actually the religion that's driving it. It's other factors. It's other ideologies that are driving it. It's just that the religion is like an easy channel or vehicle to drive the car.
Yeah, I think this point that that to take the core of the problem seriously, to take sort of violent Christian nationalism seriously, the problem of January 6th, the problem of Charlottesville, it's going to be a multidisciplinary conversation. I think that's absolutely crucial. And yet for an array of political, religious, sociological reasons, the Christian nationalism has become a vehicle for playing out a whole wide, broad array of conversations and interests and motives that I think has been not just missing the mark, but I think counterproductive.
Yeah, and this is really, really important because it seems like to that point, it seems like to me, and this is like one of the reasons why I finally wanted to have this episode, is that I wanted things to get further along just to see where things were going, where the conversation was going, like the different studies and surveys coming out and how they were being framed before I started, coming up with like critiques or solutions or whatever, is that I'm seeing a lot of the challenges and pitfalls of the violent extremism scholarship around Islamic terrorism and the damage that it did being repeated again, as if no lessons were learned there. And
Yes.
this matters
Yes.
because Christians don't just exist in the United States. Even if in this country Christians are the majority, and when you're talking about Islamic extremism, the damage it does, it was happening to a religious minority in this country, which is, adds a whole layer of trouble to the issue. But Christians exist elsewhere in the world as a minority. And if we are defining things in this way and approaching things in this way, it's not... It doesn't bode well for the conversations happening around the world, especially if this particular American brand of ideology doesn't exist there. And if we are
I think that's a critical point, Melissa.
If we are repeating the mistakes of putting a ton of people through, single national surveys into one basket, demonizing, calling them all violent, crossing that bridge very quickly from ideology to violence, it matters for people outside of the United States. It doesn't just matter here because there is a very, as it's being defined right now, it's very American what we're talking about. It doesn't mean that it's elsewhere showing up in the exact same ways. And of course, other religions are having nationalism type problems, are having similar problems, but they're different religions and they're in different countries and different contexts. And I can get into that further with another problem that I'm seeing here when it comes to large scale studies and the context of specific communities and specific groups. But I don't have to yet. If Michael, you'd like to respond right now, but I could.
No. Make the point. Yeah.
Okay. So the best studies that I have ever seen on violent extremism have always been small and usually qualitative, meaning that a group or scholars, whomever is, funded to study it, are going into actual communities and spending time there and learning exactly what is defining the people in those communities who are, radicalizing towards violence, and not just sort of holding extreme views. There's a difference between holding an extreme view, because we can define extreme in all kinds of ways that are convenient to us, but actually looking at those who would radicalize towards violent ends. So that's an important point. And spending time with those communities, because it's actually quite amazing. You can go from city to city, town to town, and talk to folks who do have a common language, where there are strands that run through them, like say like your typical like neo-Nazi group in the United States or in Europe, where there are things that tie them together across the country or across the region. But if you go into a locality, you will find that people are radicalizing or joining groups or joining an ideology for very different reasons, because of their life experiences or, mental health issues, like all kinds of stuff. I mean, you name it, and people can be attracted to things in all sorts of ways. And the best studies have actually been really localized and contextualized to actually understand why people in, I don't know, I did a lot of work in Belgium, for people who are radicalizing there towards ISIL back a few years ago. So like in Antwerp or just north of like Brussels, like why were people attracted in these communities to these particular things? In one community, there was like a masculinity thing running through the various men that were joining and becoming foreign fighters, which is just so interesting, because in other groups that just was not the thing.
Right.
So we have to, so like these cross-national surveys where it's like, a bunch of questions and questions that actually haven't been asked for too many years in a row, so we don't actually have longevity to it.
Yes.
And to ask it across the country, I actually don't find those types of surveys to be helpful at all at this point.
Yeah.
We need qualitative on-the-ground research, whether it's a journalist or a scholar. Like, we need you on the ground looking into why people are attracted to these things, what is actually leading them towards violence versus just holding certain views. And when you talk to people, this is why focus groups work as well sometimes. When you talk to people, when you ask these basic questions that are defining Christian nationalism for a lot of different groups that are studying this right now, if you ask deeper questions beyond those, like, should the federal government be informed by Christian values, you start asking some questions under that, you will get a bit deeper into what that actually means for the person that you're asking.
Yep.
Versus just saying, okay, that's a Christian nationalist view, that person is a Christian nationalist. And it's like,
So, Melissa, I'm going to ask you to pull up some of the questions that we've received.
Yes.
But just, it sounds like what you're saying is that maybe it's not a great idea to do a national survey of your made-up academic definition of Christian nationalism that consists of 5 questions. Ask Americans who aren't familiar with any of with a lot of the terminology that you use, might not connect the ideas that you're asking them about to politics at all, and then issue press releases saying that a third of Americans are Christian nationalists. It sounds like you're saying that might not be the most fruitful, beneficial approach to this conversation. And yet, that is what the folks at the Public Religion Research Institute have done. And this is one of the reasons why we're doing the podcast now. As Melissa said, sort of allowing this conversation to develop. I mean, I think important context here is my entire professional career has been in opposition to the individuals, organizations that constitute what's now being described as Christian nationalism, has also been described as the religious right or the moral majority, or that's been my career. So I'm very not just involved and sort of observing as a expert. I've been sort of in the trenches on this stuff, and I think that there are a lot of critiques and issues bound up in the Christian nationalism conversation that do address real problems that I think are better, some of which are problems which I think are better handled separate and apart from the Christian nationalism conversation. But like you, Melissa, I kind of wanted to see how this all played out. That kind of changed for me with this PRI study. And again, just a caveat, I know I've known a lot of the folks at PRI for over a decade. I think so much of the work they've done is valuable. I think I've gained and learned from their work, including on this issue. I do think this latest study that they've put out in partnership with Brookings is shoddy in its construction and not just misleading and not just unhelpful, but counterproductive and actually reinforces and supports some of the impulses that a lot of the people aligned with this conversation want to oppose and undermine. I actually think the effects of research constructed like this and communicated like this actually supports some of the negative impulses that are associated with Christian nationalism and that are also just negative in our politics, in my view, generally. Let me just walk you through this study a bit. So, and again, I just have folks who listen to this podcast know I'm usually try and be very on this hand, on that hand. This is a study constructed to achieve headlines and to serve political purposes of allied advocacy organizations. That's like at least Data for Progress releases polls that are bad for their candidates. This is this research struck me as more activist than Data for Progress, and so that's like my position on this thing. That how they measure Christian nationalism, a battery of 5 questions that they say are about the relationship between Christianity, American identity, and the U.S. government. Respondents were asked whether they completely agree, mostly disagree, or completely disagree with each of the following statements. Here are the statements. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. 2, U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. 3, if the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. 4, being Christian is an important part of being truly American. 5, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. The through line of my critique of these questions is how profoundly up for debate the implications, what is entailed by believing or saying you believe to any of these statements. I have specific critiques of specific questions. The use of the word dominion comes with a whole lot of theological implications. There is no alternative to dominion offered. It's really weird not to choose a more broadly understood term like influence. Now, dominion has a specific meaning in specific traditions, and yet this survey doesn't give us any good information that the people answering the question know what dominion is and understand that background. Several of these questions come with sort of academic understandings that people answering, likely, many of the people answering likely do not have or share the same understanding. And so there's a way in which this research strikes me as incredibly classist and problematic in that way. So those are the 5 questions that PRI asks to determine who's a Christian nationalist. Well, what did they find? They found that 10% of Americans are what they term, and again, this is all made up. Like this is and by that I mean, like, of course, all research is constructed by the researchers. It's just really important. Like, this is, as Melissa said, this is not based on a standard that has been applied in public survey research over the last 30 years, and there are all of these benchmarks.
Yep.
No, PRI is making this up with advisors, whatever, but they are going to issue press releases, and people are going to be acting on information that what they say is Christian nationalism, and Christian nationalism has the connotations that it has, due in part to the way PRI wants to frame it and the way that advocacy groups and those funding PRI's research want to frame it. So they found 10% of Americans are Christian nationalists, Christian nationalist adherents. Now, it's important. What PRI terms Christian nationalists is not equivalent to Christian nationalist adherents. Weird, right? Like, that's very confusing. Almost, you would think, like, intentionally so. We'll explain how that comes to be. But 10% are Christian nationalism adherents. These are Americans who overwhelmingly either agree or completely agree with the statement in the scale. Let me give you an example of what this means. So again, there are only 5 questions. So what makes you part of the 10% of Christian nationalists is that you either completely agree or mostly agree with these 5 statements, which again, who knows what the people answering them actually think they're answering to or about, or what the implications are. So what this means is, so 75% of Christian nationalist adherents completely agree with this statement that the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Okay, that's 3/4 of this group of 10% Americans. 50% of Christian nationalist adherents say that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. In other words, only 50% of Christian nationalist adherents completely agree to one of the 5 questions that makes them a Christian nationalist. 35% of Christian nationalist adherents say that they mostly agree with that statement. We don't have, as far as I could see, we don't have much information through any of this of what the mostly agree, like what the substance of their disagreement is. We just know that they mostly agree. Okay, mostly agree to what? So that's the Christian nationalist adherents. Now that's 10% of the population. What's interesting is Pew, relatively recently, did a survey that touched on Christian nationalism, found 10% of Americans are sympathetic to Christian nationalist ideas. So you would think, okay, well, this shows at least consistency, 10%. Well, PRI didn't want to release research. They didn't want to have press releases and articles written that said, like Pew, 10% of Americans are Christian nationalists. So what did they do? They created a category called Christian nationalist sympathizers. Well, what are Christian nationalist sympathizers? Who they call in their research Christian nationalists, though they aren't Christian nationalist adherents. They're Christian nationalist sympathizers. And what distinguishes the sympathizers from the adherents is that a majority of these Americans, 19%, so 19% of Americans are Christian nationalist sympathizers. A majority of these Americans agree, and I can't emphasize enough, it's only a majority of this group. So only a majority of the Christian nationalist sympathizers who PRI calls Christian nationalists, that Religion News Service called Christian nationalists, a majority of the group categorized as Christian nationalists as the sympathizers. A majority, which means they could be 51%, whatever. A majority of these Americans agree with the statements in the scale, but they are less likely than adherents to completely agree. This group includes 19% of Americans. I believe elsewhere in the survey, I think they say for Christian sympathizers, they had to have, and now that I say this, well, I don't want to, I'll just say this looks, what the website currently says, what the report currently says, is a majority of these Americans agree with the statements in the scale, but they are less likely than adherents to completely agree. If I recall from other aspects of the research that I read at one point, and it may still be on this page, is that the Christian nationalist sympathizers include, it's a majority of this group agree with a majority of the statements. So they might disagree with several of the 5 questions, but PRI is still gonna call them Christian nationalists. And so what does this look like for this group? So for the sympathizers, only 7% completely agree that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of society. Only 11%, this is incredible, only 11% completely agree that being Christian is an important part of being truly American. Only 17% of this Christian nationalist group say that the U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. It's just malpractice in my view. And again, if you talk to the academics, the good ones will have all, as Melissa, as you said, the good ones will have all of these caveats. Well, it actually, when you dig in, it's not clear, or even it seems that political ideology is driving the cart, not theological tenets. Mm-hmm. It seems as though this is not a. It's unclear where those we would categorize as Christian nationalists are getting their ideology. Is it from church, or is it from other sources? I want to know all these things. So all these, the academics are careful. The good ones are. But I will say a couple things. Some of them speak at events that are, the framing of the event is like defeating the evils of Christian nationalism. And yeah, like on the panel, they say, well, this is like really complicated, but they're providing legitimacy to political uses for their research that they themselves don't believe are consistent with the findings of their own research. So there has to be some accountability, responsibility for for that. Like there has to be some, and then I just say generally there has to be a cognizance among journalists, among researchers, among civic leaders who are talking about this, that even if you mean these things in a very narrow, prescriptive, defined way, that if you're promoting headlines that are, you know, a third of Americans are Christian nationalists, and the pictures for the article show the events of January 6th, then the average reader is going to say a third of Americans, and I'm saying a third because the Religion News Service article that went up on this said it was a third, even though the article was clear it was 29%. That's a whole other thing. But 29% of Americans, people are going to think, 29% of Americans could have been there on the day of January 6th.
That's what I mean about crossing the bridge from the ideology to the violence, which it matters when we talk about these things. But when you take academia to, broad strategic communications, it's difficult to do on literally any subject, going from academic language to broad public language. The last thing I want to mention, just in terms on studies and how we study this, it struck me while you were talking, Michael, because I was trying to think through, is there a study out there that was trying to create new terms or new typologies? And by typologies, I mean new ways of categorizing people. And the one study that I thought of came out in 2018 from More in Common Research, and it's called The Hidden Tribes of America. And this research took both qualitative and quantitative did those types of exercises. So they did surveys. They actually talked to people on the ground, focus groups, that sort of thing. And they were able to create, these groups of people of along political ideology. So, nothing to do with the subject at hand. I'm just talking about the Hidden Tribes of America study strikes me as a very, very good model for when you're trying to sort of create something new in a new space or a new way of thinking about an old space. Either of those things. When there's a paradigm shift, like how do you actually do it well? The Hidden Tribes of America, I would point people to that, where I think it's done well. It was a year-long study actually talking to people beyond just, rote survey questions and actually digging in deeper, so that when you come up with these new categories of people, you have real robust evidence as to why you can categorize them this way and why you feel like generally these people feel this way about this sort of thing or tend to think this thing.
But
that takes a lot of funding. And the last thing I want to say on this is that on Christian nationalism, so far, again, I am waiting to be proven wrong. I'm waiting for it to change. I'm not holding any of this tightly here, is that it seems like the funding is really going towards trying to prove that Christian nationalism exists as a very violent ideology. It seems like that's where the funding is going right now. And when you start off with funding studies that way to try to prove a thing, that's actually really bad in scholarship. You're not supposed to do that.
Yeah.
You're supposed to create hypotheses that are still questioning, like, does this exist, and does this exist in this way? We studied it over and over again to see if there are patterns, to see if we can say that there are correlations, that sort of thing.
Well, and the Hidden Tribes survey is such a great example of, they make such they make such effort to frame all of their segments as positively as possible, and like the press release, all of the energy behind their research, their purpose for doing it was, and again, this does get into this is like motivated research. Well, yeah, like, hate to break it to folks, but like huge majority of research, especially in the think tank policy space, is motivated. For Hidden Tribes, it was motivated by a sense to make the extremes as marginal as possible. Mm-hmm. So the big takeaway of the Hidden Tribes study was something like, there's 6% of the extreme on one side and 8% on the other, and they dominate the conversation. But look, there's this huge majority of like of people who aren't the extremes, and shouldn't this be cause to move to the center? And even the extremes, they come from a certain place. For all of the now, sometimes you'll watch these panels on Christian nationalism, and again, there is a certain duplicity to it, where sometimes they'll say, well, we aren't saying that all of Christian nationalism is bad. We're just defining terms. And it's just no, you can't do that. You can't be at
Michael,
you can't be
the
at
amount of times that I heard that in conversations when talking about Islamic extremism is too many. It's
right.
literally the same things repeating over again.
Crazy.
It's unbelievable. And it's for a very serious
yes.
issue that does exist and that you
yes.
and I are very concerned about. But we have to try to get it at least a bit right so that we're actually, because that's all of this matters, so that when we are actually stewarding people in a way where politics has a healthy place in their life, where politics is not ultimate,
yes.
and where they are voting for their neighbor, we want to do all that. And so then when we sort of, take these types of approaches to an issue where it's sort of we've already determined that Christian nationalism means this thing, and it always means that it's going to turn towards violence. That is very bad for when it actually does.
So here's a great example. Melissa, we've talked about this, but we didn't talk about this before our recording, but I think this goes exactly to your point. You've worked in the you've worked in the interfaith space for a long time.
Yes.
You worked specifically on Islamophobia,
yes.
and we won't sort of cite the source here. It was a private. It was in a private convening, although I think I've seen sort of parallel statements made publicly. But I'll never forget someone explaining, the way that the dialogue was set up. Mm-hmm. From the Western sort of majority perspective, the sort of academic perspective mm-hmm. was, you have these extremist, devout Muslims mm-hmm. who are a real problem. Mm-hmm. and what we need to do is the West needs to promote a modern, moderate Islam, and we don't have problems with a moderate Islam. And I remember being in a conversation with a Muslim leader who said what that suggests is that the true believers mm-hmm. are the extremists, mm-hmm. and for us to be acceptable, it doesn't mean moving closer to the heart of what we view to be the heart of the Islamic faith. The message that's being sent is that the acceptable Muslims are those who are lukewarm, who don't mm-hmm. really believe it. And this conversation...
And you'll talk to, pretty much literally any Muslim across any spectrum, whatever spectrum you're measuring on, who will say moderate Islam does not, it's like a made-up term.
Right.
It's really insulting. And what it does, again, is it places the religion at the forefront as being the problem when... there's no one ready to radicalize, but then looking at radicalization into again, ISIS, ISIL, and it's just no, it was just a tool, a channel. It was not the actual
yes.
whole thing. And so it's really problematic to do that, and I just see it repeating again.
No, it
and
is.
I could be proven wrong. Maybe that's not going to be the thing.
There's a real danger in it happening here.
Yeah.
And my concern is that if the options presented to Christians by this discourse, and frankly, I'd say by others, it's important to note, the national conservatism movement, the right-wing folks, its leader is not Christian. He calls for a return to Christian, an embrace of America's Christianity, but he's not Christian himself. James Lindsay is speaking at churches, at political rallies, quote unquote Christian political rallies. He's an avowed atheist, and so if the options presented to Americans are, you either believe that you either believe that the Christian faith ought to influence politics, that the Bible is a meaningful guide for policy and should be taken seriously, that this country has a Christian heritage, and if you believe that, you're a Christian nationalist and anathema to huge segments of the public discourse, or you don't believe these things. You don't think faith has a place in public life. You don't think that the Christian faith offers anything that would be helpful to society, and you're a constructive citizen. If those are the two choices, we're going to be pressuring huge swaths of Americans to choose the former, if those are the only two options offered. If the option is to go back to the example of a moderate Islam, if the options are you can embrace your faith, you can embrace your Christian faith, or you need to kind of like understand that it's a personal thing, really doesn't mean anything when it comes to public life, public things. That's going to be a real problem, and it's going to undermine again some of the very things that those involved in the Christian nationalism conversation say that they want to oppose, because these things are conflated. Now, if the choice is between the tiki torches in Charlottesville or the people defecating in the U.S. House of Representatives, then that's a debate I want to have. That's something you don't need to go outside of Christian resources to argue against that. There is, in my view, no stronger argument against those kinds of behaviors than the Christian faith. The problem is, and this is where I'm going to beg listeners to understand, there are a lot of different interests involved in this conversation. And I know that there are a lot of well-meaning folks who were disappointed and upset and angry and felt betrayed that evangelicals supported Trump, who feel like they don't know what's happened to their faith. And Christian nationalist expression seems to be part of the problem. And I'm like there with you on those things. What I'm going to ask you to consider is that it is not a good idea to say, well, let's just support this conversation in whatever, this Christian nationalism conversation in whatever form it takes. If it overreaches, if it sweeps in Christians and Christian ideas and approaches that aren't violent, that are maybe ignorant but not activated sort of politically, if it sweeps in a whole bunch of other stuff, it would be a mistake to say that that's acceptable collateral damage and we just need to defeat sort of the January 6th folks and then we'll worry about whether there was overreach. No. Again, because I think the overreach will come to backfire. And B, there are forces that I think there are people in advocacy groups that want to use this conversation to win arguments that I don't think a lot of people want them winning. it's really significant to note that for all of the efforts that have been made to create a definition of Christian nationalism that is limited to white conservative Republicans, researchers haven't been able to do it yet. The best that they've been able to do is come up with definitions like PRRI, definitions of Christian nationalists that include 52% of other Protestants of color, that include 43% of Hispanic Protestants, that include 38% of Black Protestants, that include 38% of Latter-day Saints. And so their definitions include these groups. And then what they'll say is, well, we're not concerned about that because the political expressions are different. At which point I say, well, it sounds like it's the politics that you're really trying to get at, not these 5 statements that you created. And then number 2, go to the Twitter page of the Secular Coalition of America. Go to the press releases for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. They aren't narrowly focused on January 6th. No, if you go to the page of Secular Coalition of America, you'll find them attacking historically Black denominations based on research around Christian nationalism and approval polls of Christians. You go to Freedom from Religion Foundation, and you'll find right alongside their dozens of press releases on every Christian nationalism survey that comes out. I think they have 4 or 5 press releases just about this PRRI research, which, again, should indicate something. You'll also find Freedom from Religion Foundation bragging for filing a lawsuit against Barack Obama for his Christian nationalism, so to speak. So, again, there's as we've both said, there are Christian nationalism. What I think is the best sort of definition, most precise definition of it, that itself is a real problem. And then what I think should be separate from a conversation about Christian nationalism. Not everything bad has to be Christian nationalism, and Christian nationalism doesn't have to be everything bad. There are real problems with the religious right that did not necessarily fall under Christian nationalism, though a lot of the same progressive advocacy groups that have been trying to defeat the religious right are now using Christian nationalism to play out the same arguments that they've been having for the last 30 years. I'm just saying, let's just continue to have those arguments and not put everything onto this Christian nationalism conversation. So my plea is bring a critical eye to this. Just because you see folks critiquing, using the banner of Christian nationalism to critique things that you disagree with, doesn't mean that everything else that they're using the term Christian nationalism is worthy of the same level of condemnation, or maybe is worthy of condemnation at all, or worthy of critique at all. This has become a behemoth in which it has become a vehicle for the playing out of the culture wars in ways that are just not helpful, Melissa.
Yeah, the two last things that I want to say, and then we have a couple of questions that we have not answered yet and what we've said from listeners. 2 things is that there was a Harvard study just this past year that studied I think it's 417 Capitol rioters. So they studied 417 people who were part of the January 6th insurrection to ask what were their motives. And those motives were derived from 469 documents filed to the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, including the charging documents in the sentencing memoranda. And far and away, they found that the two most commonly cited reasons for actually being participating in this insurrection was the desire to support Trump on January 6th in D.C. and concerns about election integrity. And then a couple other reasons that showed up a little bit was they entered the Capitol because of the belief that they were participating in a revolution, a civil war, or secession. And some of them claimed that they were there to peacefully protest, and a few others said that it was a general interest in violence. So in all of those, in like the top 4 or 5 reasons, you don't see religious reasons at all. But we do know that religious symbolism was there. We do know that speeches were made invoking Christian ideals or Christian language, scripture. We know all that was there. So, you take a study like this, and because we're constantly saying January 6th is the reason why we want to, look at Christian nationalism more.
Right. Even the leading argument for why Christian nationalism is bad, Christian nationalism can at maximum be described as a factor, not...
Yes, and so that's why I say that it's so important to look at it this way. And this is obviously only looking at like the documents sent to the court about what they were telling officials about why they were there, like in official interviews, is that I want more studies to come out over the next few years where they find these 417 rioters, actually talk to them, dig down a bit of like, well, why do you have a general interest in violence? Why would you give that answer? And see, where their Christian identity comes into it, if they even have one, and not all of them will, obviously, out of the 417, but the ones who do, like, where does it show up and how does it show up? Like, I'm very interested in those things because we know it's at play. Again, we want to repeat, we know this is an issue. We know this is at play. Michael and I think this is deeply important. But we want to, dig a bit deeper. And then the second thing is that on the definitional side of things, a really, really great interview showed up in Sojourners just a couple of months ago with Philip Gorski and Sam Perry about their latest
interview
book.
Conducted by friend of the pod, Mitchell Atencio.
Yeah, it's a great interview asking them about how
the best interview I've seen on Christian nationalism. Yeah.
By far. So I really commend that to you because I think it's a fantastic interview. If you want to dive deeper into two scholars in the field, how they're defining things, how they're thinking about things, and you'll see so much nuance in what they say in the interview. That's the thing. Yeah. And it's not their fault that it's missing from the public conversation. Right. It's just not that, It's just not there. But they're doing their job. They're communicating it. It's just not being taken up. Anyway, so I wanted to point out those two things. And then a couple of questions that we haven't just quite answered yet, but I think are really interesting is we had several questions about how do you differentiate between like Christian nationalism and patriotism? Yeah. And I think I think a lot of people are asking that in general. So, I'm not going to be able to give like an academic definition. What I will say are two things. One, patriotism can refer to general love, dedication to, reverence for, appreciation for one's country and what it stands for in one's own mind. So one can be patriotic about America because of the American dream. You could be patriotic of America because it's a land of immigrants. You could be patriotic of America because of its role in World War II. So patriotism is a feeling. It is a kind of affection. It becomes associated with certain kinds of policies. So there's a correlation between someone who would identify as very patriotic and their
support for the military, for instance. But patriotism is generally, in my view, a feeling, an affection. Nationalism, and I should say, one could be patriotic about one's country, and that doesn't necessarily entail how one views other countries, how one views people from other countries, and how one views what national policy should be regarding other countries. So I think of, like, Melissa, like, the French are both extremely patriotic, and yet the standard bearers, the incubators, the sustainers of the European Union, which is this sort of transnational.
Yep.
And so I think that's one good way to think about patriotism versus nationalism. Nationalism comes with much greater implications for what one's sense of what a nation is and how it relates to other nations and people. So patriotism is not necessarily associated with a my country first mentality. And nationalism is associated with a my country first mentality. Now, I will say, I think it's like, I think we need to be, careful about even collapsing all forms of nationalism into sort of one sort of boogeyman. I think that, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say that there are positive or desirable forms of nationalism, but there are certainly forms of nationalism that are more desirable than others. But Melissa, I'm interested in what you'd have to add to that.
Yeah, patriotism tends to stay. I'm sorry to bring up like sort of locality again, but patriotism tends to be something that is very individualized, whereas nationalism.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
Is as nationalism would say, is national. It's a part of a bigger view or a bigger picture of what a nation is, whereas patriotism is sort of something that you hold individually. Usually, obviously there are exceptions there, but nationalism, I would say that when people who are more nationalist than patriotic, a nationalist would have more definitions around like what kind of policies are actually entailed and like what kind of politics are entailed, whereas someone who's patriotic will maybe have some more opinions on like the military and like, honoring our troops and stuff, but like that's as far as like any kind of like bigger thinking or bigger picture would go. Just to keep that, not to go into like sort of academic terms here,
Melissa,
but keep it a little bit more simple.
Would you agree? And I'm just thinking of this, so I might say it, and then we might finish up the podcast, and I'll say, oh no, I should have thought of this argument. This is dumb. But would you agree? Just sort of like talking out loud here, that it's necessary to be patriotic in order to be a nationalist, but it's not necessary to be a nationalist in order to be patriotic. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a rectangle is square, but a square is a rectangle.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's right.
Yeah, I'll think about that more.
Yeah, chew on that,
generally,
folks.
Like my instinct is yeah.
I'd be interested in. I'm not sort of like publishing this anytime soon, but just I wonder if that rings true to our listeners, that you need to be patriotic in order to be a nationalist. In other words, you need to have some sort of like affection for the nation in order to want to be a nationalist, but you don't need to be a nationalist in order to have affection for your nation. So we'll leave you to chew on that little syllogism.
All right, friends, we loved having you join us today. If you're interested in learning more from Michael and Melissa, just search for Where We Are. That's WEAR in your podcast listening app and hit that follow button for more episodes.
And while you're at it, would you click follow or subscribe on the After Party feed? We want to make sure you don't miss an episode. We will be back here tomorrow and hope you join us.